This was never meant to be known by anyone. The receipt was a ghost, a thin, brittle brown piece of paper that was hidden in the binding of a tax ledger from 1849. For more than 170 years, dust and institutional silence kept it a secret. Until now. On April 11th, in the hot, humid air of Augustine Parish, Louisiana, a deal was made that was meant to be forgotten. On the steps of the courthouse, a young man, not even 19, was sold. There was never an official record of his crime. It cost 17 cents. Maeve O'Connell, a widow, bought him. She had just moved to the country, and her husband had died of the fever a year before. She needed help with her small, failing plot of land. She only saw a boy, nothing more. A deal made out of some bad luck she couldn't understand. She paid him 17 copper pennies, signed the deed with a shaky X, and took him away. She never really knew that his name wasn't Cailin. She never knew that the crime he was accused of was a lie, a carefully planned play. And she never ever knew that he had been secretly married to someone else just 3 months before. How can a story like this disappear from history? What were we never supposed to find out? A man who could make reality bend to his will didn't just bury the truth in an archive. He erased it from the world. He didn't just want to hurt the boy. He wanted him to die. He wanted him to be a footnote on a receipt for 17 cents, which is less than the value of a few nails. The quiet that came after wasn't an accident, it was planned. Judge Alistair Finch was the one who put this scary play on. In Augustine Parish, what he said was not only law, it was also scripture. He was a man made of granite and swamp shadow, and his family had been in charge of the parish's money and law for 3 generations. He had complete power, not because he owned thousands of acres of land, but because he decided what was true. He was in charge of the court, chose the sheriff, and held the mortgages on half of the businesses in town. If you crossed Judge Finch, you weren't just risking your job. You were risking your life. He could take a man's name off the voting rolls, take away his credit, or take his property on a technicality that no one else knew about. He was a king in every way but name, and his kingdom was a place of stifling order where everyone knew their place. He had bought Cailin, the boy, years before, from a trader who was passing through from Virginia. Cailin was not born on his plantation. He was quiet, very smart, and had a stillness that made the other slaves uneasy and the judge curious. Finch didn't see him as a person. He saw him as a beautiful, complicated chess piece. He secretly taught Cailin how to read, understand ledgers, and even speak a little French. It was a whim, something I wanted to do. The judge liked having something that no one else had, a mind he had grown himself and a soul he thought he had written. But once a mind is open, it is hard to control. Cailin saw the world in a way that the judge never expected. This clear vision would lead him to the one person in Augustine Parish who he was never, ever supposed to see as an equal. There is a rumor from that time that has been passed down through the Gullah communities along the coast. It talks about shadow marriages, which were unions between the powerful and the enslaved that were not legal, but were made more binding by older vows. They were secrets that could tear that society apart if they were ever made public. One of them is this story. Cailin's work eventually took him inside the judge's beautiful mansion with white pillars. He was given the job of working in the library, which was a huge, quiet room full of books from London and Paris. And it was there that he met Genevieve Finch, the judge's only child. At 17, she was a ghost in her own home. She was smart but lonely, surrounded by wealth but suffocated by her father's strict rules. A senator's son from Baton Rouge was promised to her. This would have made the Finch dynasty even stronger. Genevieve, on the other hand, had a mind as sharp as her father's, and a heart that he had long since forgotten how to care for. She didn't see Kalin as a servant or a piece of property. She saw him as the only other person in her world who seemed to be truly alive. Their talks started out as whispers that were hidden between the leather-bound spines of Voltaire and Shakespeare. He talked about the stars, and she talked about the sea. He told her the names of the stars and how they were named in African folklore. She read him poems from books that her father told her she couldn't open. They were both prisoners in the same gilded cage, and in that shared space, something beautiful and forbidden started to grow. They both knew it was a love that couldn't happen, a love that would kill them. But knowing and stopping were not the same thing. Their stolen moments became more and more frequent and desperate. The quiet of the library held a meaning that would soon tear their world apart. It wasn't just a love story, it was a rebellion of the soul. They made a promise in the middle of winter, under the bare branches of a live oak tree that had been there for 300 years. They knew that no priest would marry them and that no law would recognize their marriage. They found an old woman named Elizabeth on the edge of the swamp. She was a root doctor who followed traditions that went back before the parish and even before America. In a ceremony lit by a single candle, with vows spoken in a mixture of English and a language the judge would have called pagan nonsense, they bound themselves to each other. For a few stolen weeks they were husband and wife in a kingdom of two, and their secret was a weak shield against the world. But secrets in a place like Augustine Parish have a way of getting out. A misplaced book, a look that lasts a second too long, or a note found by a house servant who is loyal to the judge. We don't know how Finch found out, but his rage was well known. It was not the hot, screaming rage of a common man. It was a cold fury, a terrifying, silent pressure that seemed to suck the very air out of a room. He didn't talk to them. He didn't get mad or blame anyone. He just started moving his pieces. The first step was to cut Genevieve off from everyone else. She was kept in her rooms with no books and no windows. The walls of her world got smaller and smaller, until all she could see was her father's cold, hard face. He never yelled. He just calmly told her that she had brought shame on her name, her family, and her God. He said she was sick, that her mind had been poisoned, and that he could help her get better. It was a psychological war campaign meant to completely break her spirit. His second move was to attack Kalin. The judge knew that killing the boy would be too kind and would make him a martyr. No, death was the end. The judge needed an eraser. He had to completely destroy the man his daughter had chosen, bringing him down to such a low and pathetic state that Genevieve would be ashamed of even thinking about him. He came up with a plan that was very cruel. He buried a silver locket in Kalin's small sleeping area. It was a gift he had given his daughter years ago. Then he had the sheriff, a man whose job and life were in Finch's hands, find the stolen item. Stealing was a common crime, but stealing from the judge's own family was a sin that could never be forgiven. Kalin was pulled out of bed in the middle of the night. He never saw Genevieve again. He was taken to the parish jail, a damp stone box where he spent 2 weeks without saying a word. He didn't get whipped. He wasn't beaten. The judge was cruel in a more subtle way. He was left alone in the dark with only the silence and the rats to think about how powerless he was. The charge was read out loud. Theft of property worth $20. According to parish law, the punishment was to be sold at a public auction. Everything was completely legal, but it was all a huge lie. The judge himself signed the order, and his handwriting was as beautiful and harsh as he was. He wasn't just killing a man. He was changing a story, rewriting a truth that upset him, and making sure that the final draft didn't mention his daughter's love. The auction was going to happen on April 11th. The morning was hot and hazy, and it felt like a storm was coming later in the day. A small group of people, mostly farmers and small-time merchants, with weathered faces and calculating eyes, gathered on the courthouse lawn. They were there for cows, for a stolen cotton gin, and for the boring business of a parish that was having a hard time. Kalin was the last lot of the day. He was brought out onto the steps, his hands bound in front of him. The judge had made it clear that he had to be clean. He was not to look like a common field hand. He was to look like what he was: a house slave, something refined, something that had fallen from a great height. Bartholomew, the auctioneer, started the auction. He owed Judge Finch a lot of money. He didn't say anything about Kalin's intelligence, literacy, or skills. He just said what the charge was and what the sentence was. Then he announced the opening bid. He yelled, "The court sets the price." His voice was strained. "At 17 cents. A murmur of confusion spread through the crowd. 17 cents. It was rude, that was funny. An enslaved man in his prime was worth hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars, even if he was accused of stealing. This price was so low that it could only mean one of two things. Either the man was secretly sick and dying, or this was something else. The smarter men in the crowd knew right away that this wasn't a sale. It was a ritual, a public shaming done by an unseen hand. To bid would mean getting involved in the business of the powerful, which no one in Augustine Parish was stupid enough to do. The silence was long and thick, and it was hard to deal with. Maeve O'Connell, the widow, made her move when there was a lot of silence. She didn't get the politics. She didn't see the invisible lines of power that were in the air. She only saw a boy who looked lost and a price she could afford. Her husband had left her with 3 acres of land that hadn't been plowed, and a bill at the general store. She could get help for 17 cents. It was simple, but desperate math. She pushed her way through the small crowd, and even though it was hot, her shawl was tight around her shoulders. "I'll take him," she said, her voice thin but clear. 17 cents. Bartholomew, the auctioneer, looked shocked. He nervously looked over at the courthouse where he knew Judge Finch was watching from his office window. This wasn't supposed to happen. The plan was for Kalin to stay there until the auction was over, like a piece of trash that no one wanted to touch. He would then be sent to the parish work farm, where no one ever came back healthy. But there had been a bid, a legal and public one. If you don't accept it, you would be breaking the laws that the judge said he would uphold. Bartholomew hesitated, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. 17 cents, from the widow, he yelled, his voice breaking. He looked around, hoping that someone would speak up and do something to stop this unexpected problem. But the crowd stayed quiet, their faces showing both fear and pity. They knew what this woman did not. She wasn't just buying a slave. She was picking up a cursed object, a piece of a story she was never meant to be a part of. "Going once?" Bartholomew stammered, looking back and forth between the window and the courthouse. "Going twice?" He stopped to give the universe one last chance to fix this mistake. Nothing. The cicada screamed in the trees, making a sound like frayed nerves. "Sold," he finally said, slamming his gavel down with a sound that felt both final and very wrong. "To the widow O'Connell for 17 cents. Maeve counted the coins and then dropped them into Bartholomew's sweaty hand, her hand shaking a little. A clerk wrote up the deed of sale, and his hands moved so quickly that it seemed like he wanted to get rid of the document as soon as possible. Maeve signed with her X. The deal was done. She had just bought a person for the price of a spool of thread. He didn't look at her as she led Kalin away from the courthouse steps. He stared at the second-story window where he knew the judge was watching. For a brief, intense moment, their eyes met across the square. That look said 1,000 things that didn't need to be said. The judge's face said, "See what I've made you." And Kalen's face said something else. Not defeat, not hatred, but a terrifying, unshakable promise. Maeve didn't see any of it. She was a poor widow who had to make a deal out of desperation. She had no idea that she was now the keeper of a king's ruined treasure, the accidental guardian of a secret that could still destroy Augustine Parish. She was taking him home to her small, dusty cabin, not knowing that she had just bought a man who was married to the daughter of the most powerful man. Robert Louis Stevenson, a philosopher, is credited with saying, "The cruelest lies are often told in silence." This quote perfectly describes the mood in the O'Connell cabin in the days that followed. Maeve didn't know how to handle Kalen. He wasn't rebellious, but he wasn't there. He worked from dawn to dusk, clearing the stubborn, clay-packed soil. He was always on the move and never tired. He did everything she told him to do, and his obedience was so complete that it made her uneasy. But he never talked unless someone else did, and his eyes looked haunted and far away, as if he were looking at a world that only he could see. Maeve made an effort to talk to him. She asked him about his life before, and he said, "I was in service, ma'am." She then asked if he had a family, and he shook his head. The cabin was quieter than the air outside, which was humid. There was a silence full of his unspoken past and her unasked questions. She was a simple woman who was religious and kind. Slavery had always been an idea to her, something that happened on big plantations far away from her small life. It was now sitting at her rough-hewn table, a living, breathing mystery. She found herself watching him and trying to figure out the puzzle. His hands were rough from working on the farm, but they weren't the hands of a field worker. They were thin and long. He had a grace about him that seemed out of place, even though he was wearing old clothes. One night, she saw him looking up at the stars with his lips moving but no sound coming out. He wasn't praying. He was naming the stars. The judge, on the other hand, was filled with a quiet, growing rage. The widow's interference had ruined the perfect balance of his revenge. Kalen was supposed to fade away into the anonymity of the parish work farm, which was a place of slow, grinding oblivion. Instead, he was living just 2 miles away, a constant, living reminder of his daughter's betrayal. Every day that Kalen lived was an insult to the judge's authority. He couldn't stop thinking about it. He had the sheriff ride by the O'Connell house twice a day, which was a quiet way to scare them. He put pressure on the owner of the general store to refuse Maeve credit, hoping to starve her out and make her sell the boy. But Maeve was tough, and the small group of poor farmers who didn't like the judge started to help her in small ways. They left a sack of flour on her porch and a few jars of preserves. They thought it was a quiet way to stand up to the man who had them all under his thumb. The judge was getting more and more angry. He had to get rid of Kalen, but he couldn't let it be known that he was behind it. There couldn't be another public show. It had to be silent. Finally, he started looking for a tool, a man who could work in the dark and get rid of a problem without leaving any evidence. He found a man like that in Roach, a Cajun tracker who lived deep in the swamps and was said to have skills that weren't completely natural. Roach was a man who could find people who didn't want to be found and make them disappear for a fee. Things on the farm started to change in small ways. Kalen began to show bits of his true self as he realized that the judge was still looking at him. He took a calculated risk because he needed someone to help him, and this simple widow was the only one he could find. One evening, he noticed her struggling with her late husband's account book. She could read numbers, but not words. He stepped forward quietly. "May I?" he asked in a soft voice. He took the ledger and in a few minutes had organized the chaotic entries, his handwriting a fluid, elegant script. Maeve looked at the page, then at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked in a low voice. He said, the judge valued certain skills, which was the first time she had ever heard him say something ironic. He started to help her in other ways, like showing her how to fix tools she thought were broken and how to water the fields better. He was more than just a worker. He was a builder of survival. They began to form a weak, unspoken bond. Not yet friends, but two people who were tired of fighting over the same piece of driftwood in a huge, hostile ocean. Maeve stopped seeing him as just 17 cents worth of muscle and started to see him as a man with a lot of depth and mystery. And with that realization came a terrifying thought. Whatever he had done to incur the wrath of Judge Finch, it must have been something extraordinary. She was hiding not only a runaway, but also a secret. She began to realize that secrets in Augustine Parish cost a lot. An old parish diary gave a scary description. Saw the judge's man, Roch, in town today. He does not walk like other men. He glides, silent as a water moccasin. In his eyes, they are the color of swamp mud and they see everything you try to hide. This was the man who now began to circle Maeve's small farm. Kaelin could feel him there before he saw him. It was a change in the air, a stillness in the woods that felt unnatural. The birds would stop singing, and the bugs would stop buzzing. It was the quiet of a hunter getting closer to his prey. Kaelin understood what it meant. The judge was getting tired of waiting. The clock was ticking down. He had to do something. He had one last card up his sleeve, a secret he had kept from Genevieve. Before he was taken, he had hidden the only proof of his marriage. It wasn't a piece of paper that could be burned. It was something much more permanent. He had a small book of poetry that Genevieve had given him. On the inside back cover, he had written a short story about their vows and their secret ceremony using ink he had made from berries and rust. He had also signed it. He had pricked Genevieve's finger with a needle and pressed her bloody thumbprint to the page next to his name. It was a sign, a piece of truth that couldn't be denied. If that book were ever found, it would be a permanent mark on the Finch legacy, a story that could not be easily erased. The judge would never think to look for the book in the old parish church, where it was hidden behind a loose stone in the back of the fireplace. Kaelin knew he couldn't get the book back himself. Someone was watching him, and every move he made was closely watched. He had to send a message to someone, but he didn't trust anyone. The judge's spies were everywhere in the parish, so he came up with a crazy plan that depended on the bravery of a woman who still didn't know anything. He began to draw in the dirt, scratching out patterns with a stick while he worked in the fields. At first, Maeve thought it was just mindless doodling, but then she saw that the patterns were very detailed, almost like maps. He didn't look at her when she brought him a cup of water one night. He kept drawing, and his finger drew a line from a rough picture of her cabin to a picture of the church steeple. Next, he drew a small square inside the church and a shape that looked like a flame next to it. He looked up at her, his eyes conveying a desperate, silent plea. It was a message without words, a map made of dust. He thought she would get it. Maeve's stomach felt like it was tied up in a cold knot of fear. She understood what he wanted, for her to go to the church and the fireplace. He asked her to get something for him. To do this would mean going from being a passive observer to an active conspirator in this drama. It was a choice. She could use her foot to erase the map, act like she didn't understand, and spend the rest of her life quietly serving. Or she could trust this strange, quiet man she had bought for 17 cents and go right into the storm. Maeve couldn't move for 2 days because she couldn't make up her mind. The fear of Judge Finch was a physical thing, a sickness in her gut. But the way Kaelin looked at her stayed with her. It wasn't the look of a criminal. It was the look of a man trying to save his own soul. She made her choice on the third night. She left her cabin with a small lantern in her hand after Kaelin had fallen asleep in the small barn that was his home. The 2-mile walk to the church was the longest of her life. Every sound in the trees made me think of the swamp tracker Roche. The judge's cruel, calculating gaze seemed to be in every shadow. There was no sound or light in the church. The door in the back was never locked. She tiptoed inside, where the air was cool and smelled like old wood and candle wax. She found the fireplace, and her heart raced. Her fingers were rough and calloused from working on the farm as she searched the stones in the dim light of the lantern. She found it. A single stone that was a little loose. She used a broken piece of kindling to pry it open. A small, leather-bound book was inside the dark hole, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. She took it out, and her hand shook so badly that she almost dropped it. She didn't want to know, so she didn't open it. She just knew it was the source of all this danger, the secret that was worth more than a man's life. She put it in her apron, put the stone back, and ran back into the night, the book feeling like a block of ice on her skin. She had gone too far. There was no way to go back now. Kaylin was waiting for her outside the cabin when she got back to the farm just before dawn. He wasn't in the barn. He was standing there watching the road like he was on duty. He saw the book in her hands, and for the first time since they met, he looked like he felt something other than despair. It was such a deep sense of relief that it was hard to watch. He took the book from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he said in a voice full of emotion. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice shaking. "You just have to tell me what to do now." Before he could answer, a dog on a nearby farm started barking like crazy, and then another dog did the same thing. Kaylin's head shot up, and his body went stiff. "He's here," he said in a flat, cold voice. "Roach." He put the book back in her hands. "There is a man," he said quickly and clearly. "His name is Silas. He works the ferry at the Black Creek Crossing. He is an old friend, one of the few the judge does not own. Give him this book. Tell him the Mockingbird is free." Maeve looked at him with a blank expression. "What about you?" "The judge doesn't just want the book," Kaylin said, his eyes already looking past her to the dark trees. "He wants me. I'll take Roach away from here. I'll give you time. Go now." He ran away, not toward the road, but straight into the thick, tangled woods behind the cabin. This was a planned, sacrificial act. Maeve stood still for a moment, holding the book and hearing his strange message over and over. Then she heard someone moving through the bushes, and they were moving quickly and quietly, which made her uneasy. She ran away. Maeve ran like she had never run before, her breath tearing at her lungs, and the dark woods closing in on her from all sides. She didn't know the way. She tripped over roots, and branches that hung low hit her in the face. She ran toward the Black Creek without knowing why, driven by a fear she had never felt before. She could hear the chase behind her. It wasn't the sounds of a clumsy pursuit. It was the eerily efficient sounds of a predator. A broken twig here, a quiet step there, and Kaylin, further ahead, making just enough noise to keep the hunter focused on him, drawing the danger away from her. It was a race to see who could get up first. She finally broke free from the woods and onto the muddy banks of Black Creek. It was just a simple wooden raft that worked with a pulley system. A black man with gray hair and a hunched back stood next to it, getting ready for the first crossing of the day. "Silas," she said, stumbling toward him. The man looked up, and his eyes were sharp and smart. He saw her ripped dress, her scared look, and the book she was holding. "Are you Silas?" she asked again, her voice frantic. "I am," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Kaylin sent me," she panted, holding out the book. "He said to give you this. He said, 'The Mockingbird is free.'" Silas's face, which had seen a lot of weather, didn't show any surprise. He took the book with a steady hand and a serious look on his face. He knew how to read the code. It meant that Kalen was putting into action the last, most desperate part of their plan. That meant he probably wouldn't make it through the night. He had decided to give up his life to make sure the truth lived on. A single sharp cry, a sound of pain, came from across the creek and was suddenly cut off. Maeve shivered, and her blood ran cold. She was sure it was Kalen. Silas's jaw got tight. "Ma'am, get on the ferry," he said in a hurry. He didn't wait for her. He untied the rope and started to pull them through the brown water that was churning. His old muscles were straining to do it. When they got to the middle of the creek, they saw him. Roach, the tracker, came out of the trees on the other side. He had a long, sharp knife in his hand, and the blade was dark. He stood there watching the ferry, his face showing how angry he was. He was late. Maeve looked at the man who had just hunted and probably killed the boy she had bought for 17 cents. She felt a wave of nausea and grief so intense it buckled her knees. She had been a piece in a game she didn't understand, and people were dying because of it. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice rough and broken. Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the far bank, as if he wanted the tracker to try to cross. "Now," he said, his voice full of deep, tired sadness, "the judge loses." He took the book out of his coat and held it up for Roach to see across the water, a sign of defiance and a promise that this story would not end in the swamp's silence. Roach just turned around and disappeared into the woods, his mission both a success and a huge failure. They crossed the creek and entered a land that felt like a different country, a place where the judge's power couldn't reach right away. Silas locked up the ferry and took Maeve to a small hidden cabin that was only a short walk from the shore. An oil lamp lit up a simple room inside. Silas put the book on the table with a respect that surprised her. "You are safe here for now," he said. "Who are you?" Maeve finally asked. "Really?" "I knew Kalen's mother," Silas said, his voice getting lower and sounding like he was confessing. "Years ago, before the judge bought her, we were from the same place in Virginia. I promised her I would look out for her boy." He paused, his gaze distant. "I failed. I stood by and did nothing for years because I was too scared of what the judge could do. Kalen knew I ran this ferry and that I had connections to people who help others disappear, the Underground Railroad. He called me weeks ago, before any of this happened. He thought the judge knew his secret. We made a plan, a desperate one. He wouldn't leave without proof, without this book." He tapped the cover. "A man's life is short, but the truth can last forever if someone is brave enough to protect it," he said. Finally, he looked at her, and his eyes were full of deep sadness. "He didn't think he would live. He made me promise that I would get the book north, no matter what. He gave up his life so that everyone would know what Judge Finch did to his own daughter." Maeve finally gave in. The tears she had held back for days, for weeks, finally calming a storm of grief for a boy she barely knew but whose courage had shattered her world. She cried for the love he had lost, the life he had stolen, and the terrible, horrible unfairness of it all. Silas stayed quiet while she cried, showing respect for her sadness. She looked at the book on the table when she was done. Her body hurt from all the crying. "His wife," she said, her voice shaking. "What happened to the judge's daughter?" Silas's face got hard. After the judge locked her up, he brought in a doctor from New Orleans who specializes in female hysteria. They said she was mentally unfit and a danger to herself. She was sent to an asylum in Mobile, where people go to be forgotten. She's a prisoner, just like Kalen was. The judge didn't just take her husband. He took her mind, her freedom, and even her name. The world thinks Genevieve Finch had a nervous breakdown and was sent away for her health. The story is neat, clean, and completely false. It was so cruel that it took my breath away. It was a killing of the soul, a completely legal and socially acceptable way to end someone's life. The judge didn't just get rid of Kaylin. He also got rid of his own daughter, turning her into a ghost long before she died. Maeve got it now. The 17 cents, the auction, and the tracker were all part of a carefully planned, evil plan to control everything. And she, the clueless widow, had walked onto the stage and ruined the last act. Maeve asked in a whisper, "What's in the book?" Silas carefully opened it. He looked at the inside back cover. There, in Kaylin's beautiful handwriting, was the story of their secret wedding. There were 2 signatures below the text. One of them was Kaylin's. The other was not a signature. It was a small, brown-red smudge that looked like a bloody thumbprint. "Genevieve's mark," Silas said in a low voice. "He told me about it. Proof that she took the vow of her own free will. In the right hands, this book destroys the judge's whole story. It shows that he made up the theft charge and put his own daughter in a mental hospital to hide a truth he couldn't handle." He put the book down. "My contacts will send this to abolitionist publishers in Philadelphia. It will be printed. The story will be told. It won't bring Kaylin back. It might not even free Genevieve. But it will be a crack in the judge's throne. It will be a fire that he can never completely put out." He looked at Maeve with a serious face. "But you can never go back to Augustine Parish. The judge will always be looking for you. You're the loose end, the witness who knows everything." Maeve thought about her little farm, which was the only home she had. She thought about the grave of her husband. It was all gone, erased by a history she never wanted to be a part of. She was adrift, a refugee from a secret war. "Where will I go?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. "North," Silas said. "We'll get you to a safe place, a new life. It's the least we can do. It's what he would have wanted." And so Maeve O'Connell vanished, with the help of Silas and the quiet, determined network of the Underground Railroad. She traveled at night, hiding in barns and secret cellars, and kept going north until the Spanish Moss of Louisiana was just a bad memory. She got a new name, cut her hair, and became a new person. A woman with no past. The book was a wholly dangerous relic that she carried with her. It was passed from one steady hand to another until it finally got to Philadelphia. An anonymous pamphlet started to go around in the spring of 1850. The book was called A Parish of Lies, and it was about a powerful Southern judge, his daughter, and the educated slave he killed to protect his family's name. It didn't name Judge Finch or Augustine Parish directly, because that would have been too risky for the printers. But the details were clear enough that the people in charge in Louisiana knew exactly who it was about. The mainstream media called the story abolitionist propaganda, but it was too late. The whispering had begun. The throne had a crack in it. The judge's power, which had once seemed like it couldn't be stopped, now had a limit. He became more secretive and paranoid, thinking that every shadow was a sign of betrayal. He spent a lot of money looking for the widow who had disappeared and the person who had sent him the pamphlet. But he couldn't find either. He was up against a ghost. Once the truth was out, it couldn't be put back in. What about the rest? In 1863, Judge Alistair Finch died not from a bullet in the war that tore his world apart, but from a stroke while he was alone in his grand library, surrounded by the books that had been the backdrop for his daughter's forbidden love. People say that in his last years he would get angry at people he couldn't see. His mind was full of enemies, both real and imagined, who had ruined his perfect legacy. Genevieve Finch spent the rest of her life in the Mobile Asylum. In 1888, she passed away. Pneumonia was the official cause of death, but the records from the asylum say that she spent the last 40 years of her life in a state of quiet, detached silence, never speaking to anyone. No one knows if her silence was because of the asylum's cruel treatments, or if she chose to mourn forever. She turned into the ghost that her father had always wanted her to be. The tracker Roach went back into the swamps. His name appears one last time in the historical record, in a sheriff's report from 1854. His body was found floating in a bayou, bloated and unrecognizable. The report says an alligator attack was the cause, but old rumors say that someone finally caught up with him and paid off a debt from that night on Black Creek. Silas kept running his ferry, which helped many people find their way to freedom. He was a quiet, unassuming man, and his act of atonement lasted a lifetime. And Kalin, they never found his body. Roach probably buried him in a grave in the swamp that wasn't marked, where the dark Louisiana soil absorbed another soul. The judge's plan worked. He was erased. But his story, the one he died to protect, lived on. People who knew the truth told it as a warning story that spread quietly. It was a testament to the fact that you can silence a person, but you cannot kill an idea. You can bury a body, but you can't bury the truth forever. Maeve, the widow, lived to be an old woman in a small town in Ohio. She never talked about what happened, but they say she kept a small worn-out pamphlet in a locked box until the day she died. It told the story of the boy she bought for 17 cents, the boy who was secretly a husband, a rebel, and a king in a world that wouldn't see him. If you visit Augustine Parish today, you will find no official record of any of this. The name Finch is still on the courthouse and the library. History is the story of the people who won. Some of the older people might tell you a different story if you go to the Black Creek Crossing. They'll tell you about a ghost that walks through the woods looking for a book. They'll tell you about a love that was stronger than the law and a truth that cost them everything. If you've made it this far with me down this dark and secret path, please leave a comment saying, "The Mockingbird is free." You're not just watching a story anymore. You're becoming a keeper of it, a witness to a history that was meant to be erased. Isn't it hard to carry the weight of knowing something that was meant to be forgotten? The 17-cent receipt is now a historical oddity in a university archive. Most people who see it just see a strange, sad deal from a time when things were rough. They shake their heads at the price because it's so cruel, but they don't know what really happened. They don't know what the ink is all about. They don't see the ghost of a secret marriage, the cold anger of a powerful judge, or the bravery of a woman who chose to trust a stranger. They don't know that those 17 pennies were the price of a king's ransom in love and rebellion. They see a receipt for a slave, but you see a declaration of war, a war fought in whispers, in hidden books, and in the hearts of those who refuse to be erased. It's a reminder that the most important histories are often the ones that leave the faintest tracks, the ones you have to dig for, the ones you have to fight to keep alive, the ones that powerful men tried to bury under the weight of their laws and their lies. The system that let Judge Finch be who he was and do what he did was not just a bunch of laws, it was a mental prison. It was based on the idea that some people were things, and that their lives and loves were only worth what their owners gave them. Kalin and Genevieve didn't steal anything, and it wasn't just love. They thought they were equal, which was a crime. Seeing the full humanity in each other was their act of rebellion. That was the only sin that the judge and everyone else in the world he represented could not stand. Because if a slave and a master's daughter could be husband and wife, if they could be bound by a vow that transcended law and property, then the entire foundation of their society was a lie. It would mean that power was just a made-up thing, that social order was a weak story, and that the chains were not only on the wrists of the enslaved, but also on the minds of the enslavers. The judge had to kill them, not only to punish them, but also to keep his own sanity and strengthen the walls of the reality he had built around himself. His cruelty wasn't just a way to get back at someone, it was a way to save himself from death. He was trying to kill a truth that could have shown him to be a fraud, a king ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. Think about the widow Maeve. In many ways, she is the most important person in this story. She wasn't a hero, she was not against slavery. She was just a normal person who had to make an unusual choice. She stands for us. What would you really do? What would you do? Would you see the wrong and walk away, scared of what would happen? Would you try to convince yourself that it wasn't your problem? A lot of people would. The apathy of good people is the quiet, terrible engine that lets evil grow. Maeve, on the other hand, was a poor, uneducated widow with nothing to her name. She decided to look at the man instead of the slave. Even though it scared her, she chose to trust. She chose to act. Her small, brave act of running through the woods with a book she couldn't even read was stronger than all the judge's laws, money, and anger. She didn't just save a book, she saved the truth. She became the unlikely vessel for a story that was never meant to be told. It's a scary reminder that the course of history isn't always decided by kings or generals, but by the small decisions that regular people make when they are in tough situations. The choice to help, the choice to listen, the choice to run. There has been one last disturbing rumor about Genevieve Finch. The older nurses at the mobile asylum used to tell a story about the woman in room 213 who never spoke. They said that every year, on the anniversary of the April 11th auction, she would do one thing. She would draw a picture on the wall of her cell with a piece of charcoal, or even her own blood if she had to. The picture was always the same, a mockingbird with its throat cut. Every year, the asylum staff would scrub the walls clean of the strange, sad graffiti, but it would always come back. A yearly memorial in silence for a love that had been lost, a message to a world that had forgotten about her. It was the last thing she could do to rebel, a memory that wouldn't go away. It seems to say that even though her father ruined her life, he never really broke her spirit. She still loved Colin, and 40 years of institutional abuse couldn't touch that love. It was her own book, written on the walls of her prison. It was a story told in silence and blood, a last testament to the man she had married and the man they had tried and failed to turn into nothing more than a 17-cent ghost. Can you picture that? A love that is so strong that it lives on even after the mind dies. So why was this story so hard to find? Why would generations of historians and archivists who found parts of it choose to put it back together? It doesn't just accuse one man, one judge in a small town. It points the finger at the whole system he stood for. It shows that the law is not a tool for justice, but a way to control people. It shows how simple it is for people to do terrible things while still acting civilized. This story is risky. It says that the official records we use to learn about history, like court orders and deeds of sale, aren't always true. They are often just the narrative written by the powerful. The truth about history is in the whispers, the rumors, the pamphlets that don't say who wrote them, and the drawings on the walls of an asylum. What they tried to erase is the real history. It was wrong to sell Kalin for 17 cents. It was a perversion of the idea of value. It was an act of economic and spiritual warfare meant to show that a man's worth could be determined, and that a soul could be valued and found lacking. It was the ultimate show of power, so strong that it could say a person was worthless and make it legal. But they were wrong. His life was not worth nothing. It was worth everything. And the proof is that we are here now, more than 100 years later, digging up his story and telling it. We are the sound he made when he died. The point is that you are feeling what you are feeling right now. That chill, that sense of unease, and that righteous anger. These kinds of stories aren't meant to be easy to read. They are supposed to wake something up inside of you. They are meant to remind you that the world you see is built on a foundation of stories, and some of those stories are deliberate, monstrous lies. The history we learn is often like a museum that only shows artifacts that back up the official story. But the real history is a haunted house full of the ghosts of people who were silenced, erased, and forgotten. Their stories are still there, in the walls, in the archives, and in the soil, waiting for someone brave enough to hear them. The story of Cailin, Genevieve, and the widow who bought him for 17 cents is more than just a sad story from the past. It's a key. It unlocks a door in your mind and forces you to ask a dangerous question. What other truths have been buried? What other spirits are waiting to be heard? Things are not what they seem. We live in the aftermath of secrets. Our lives are shaped by battles that were fought and lost in silence long before we were born. This is just one of those stories. There are a lot more. They are waiting for you. That morning's transaction in Augustine Parish was meant to be the end of a story. Judge Finch thought he was the author and that he could write the last chapter and end a love story that he didn't like. He used the law, the economy, and the fear of his neighbors as his ink. He thought he had made a perfect, silent monument to his own power by erasing something. But he did one very important thing wrong. He forgot that stories, real stories, aren't written down. They're written on the heart. And the heart has a memory that no law can erase, no ledger can hold, and no amount of time can really erase. He thought he was closing a book, but all he did was make a ghost. This ghost has been haunting the edges of history for 170 years, waiting for someone to finally say its name. He wanted to show that a man could be worth only 17 cents. Instead, he showed that one brave act of love could mean everything. Now you know.